Night had fallen over the Baltic coast when a team of construction workers struck metal beneath the docks of Gdynia. The sound was hollow, deliberate. Beneath decades of soil and silence, they found a sealed steel hatch, cold to the touch, untouched since the war. As the lock finally gave way, stale air drifted out carrying the scent of rust, oil, and something older, forgotten. Flashlights cut through the dark, revealing crates marked with faded eagles and the code, Project Morgenlicht. In that instant, history exhaled. What they had uncovered wasn't just a bunker. It was the beginning of a secret buried by two superpowers, now brought back into the light. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Vault Beneath Gdynia. Before the war, Gdynia was a city of growth and promise. Ships lined the harbour, engines droning against the gulls overhead. Poland stood between two great powers, still young, still defiant. On its cobbled streets, fishermen mended nets beside newly built naval yards, a symbol of hope in a Europe already trembling. But hope in 1939 was a fragile thing. Across the border, Germany's factories hummed through the night, producing more than steel. They forged intent. When the first shells struck the Westerplatte Peninsula, only 50 miles away, the echoes reached Gdynia's shores within minutes. Men ran to their posts. Mothers gathered children into basements. The air was thick with sirens, smoke, and disbelief. The war had come fast, and it had come home. As the Wehrmacht advanced, the Polish Navy scuttled its ships, refusing to let them fall into enemy hands. The occupiers arrived with maps and orders, precise, methodical, merciless. Within weeks, entire sections of Gdynia's port were sealed off under German control. Locals whispered about new construction near the cliffs, a restricted zone surrounded by barbed wire. Trucks came and went at night, covered in tarps. The guards didn't speak. They just watched. Under the surface, something massive was being built. Official records from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, mentioned Strategische Speicherstelle 47, or Strategic Storage Site 47. To civilians, it meant nothing, but to those who worked the docks, it became a name they feared. Every few days, men disappeared from the work crews. Their names were never called again. The whispers grew darker. Some said the tunnels stretched deep beneath the coastline, built to store fuel or weapons. Others believed it was something far stranger. By 1943, Gdynia had transformed from a Polish port into a fortress of the Reich. The Allies bombed the area repeatedly, but the cliffs and bunkers held firm. Beneath them, scientists worked in secrecy, protected by SS units and the thick silence of war. Among their projects was one marked only by a single codename, Project Morgenlicht, Project Morning Light. No one knew its true purpose. The surviving documents, found decades later in that buried vault, spoke of propulsion systems beyond conventional design. Engines that used compressed air and magnetic force. Experimental physics, far ahead of its time. Yet what stood out in those papers wasn't just the technology, it was the language. Phrases like adaptation for atmospheric return and launch stabilization. In 1944, these were words that belonged to science fiction, not warfare. Then, as Germany collapsed, the activity beneath Gdynia stopped overnight. The entrances were sealed, files burned, witnesses silenced. Soviet troops arrived months later, claiming control of the port. But instead of dismantling the site, they built over it. A new port, a new regime. The tunnels disappeared from maps, erased as if they'd never existed. For the next 75 years, Gdynia's harbour thrived above what no one knew was there. Ships came and went. Generations passed. The city rebuilt, moved on, and forgot, until that day in 2021, when a single blow from a steel drill cracked open history's longest silence. The bunker beneath was still dry. Its walls carried markings in German, then Cyrillic. Soviet seals from the 1950s layered over Nazi insignia. Inside, investigators found documents stamped with two opposing emblems, the Reich and the USSR, both claiming ownership. It was an impossible sight. How could enemies of such brutal hatred share a single secret? The discovery shook historians, engineers, and intelligence agencies across Europe. For Poland, it reopened wounds buried deep since the occupation. For the West, it raised an even darker question. If both sides had known about this bunker, if both had chosen to hide it, then what else had been buried with it? The vault beneath Gdynia was more than an artifact. It was a mirror, reflecting the quiet deals and moral compromises that bridged one war to the next. And in the still air of that underground chamber, surrounded by the relics of two vanished empires, one truth became clear. The past doesn't sleep, it waits. Beneath concrete, beneath history, beneath the weight of what nations choose to forget. Chapter 2. Operation. Winterglass, Files from the Cold Divide. In the long freeze that followed World War II, the world divided itself not just by borders, but by fear. The Allies had won, yes, but peace was fragile, thin as frost. By 1947, two visions of the future faced each other across Europe, one draped in stars and stripes, the other under the hammer and sickle. Both spoke of freedom, both meant control. While cities rebuilt and families mourned, the intelligence war began in silence. It moved through cables, couriers, and coded transmissions, an invisible struggle between superpowers that would last for decades. Beneath this new world order, science became a weapon. Laboratories replaced battlefields. Men in white coats replaced soldiers. In the East, Soviet research institutes were expanding into places no map dared name. Deep in the Arctic Circle, beyond the reach of Western eyes, a joint Soviet-East German operation was established under the code Zimno-Steklo, Winterglass. Officially, it was a climate research program designed to study permafrost thaw and glacial shifts. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. The files uncovered decades later told a story written in cold precision. Tests on microorganisms found trapped in the ice for millennia. Specimens capable of surviving in environments devoid of oxygen, light, or heat. The scientists of Winterglass sought to turn these discoveries into tools of war. Biological agents that could corrode fuel, disrupt machinery, or contaminate supply lines without ever firing a shot. A young East German researcher named Klaus Rehfeld kept a private journal smuggled out through coded letters to his wife in Leipzig. "The cold hides everything," he wrote in 1961. "What we do here could change the balance of power, but sometimes, at night, I wonder if it's power that should remain buried." His entries stopped abruptly after January 1962. The next month, the facility ceased all radio communication. When the Iron Curtain finally fell, fragments of the Winterglass archives were discovered, sealed in an unmarked Stasi warehouse, pages frozen together by time and mold. Most were routine, shipment logs, weather data, supply manifests, but within one folder lay a report labeled Anomaly 43. It described a containment breach during a test sequence, a reaction that melted through reinforced flooring, releasing gas that caused severe respiratory failure among exposed personnel. The file ended with an instruction, handwritten in red pencil. Terminate all surviving subjects. Seal the chamber. Erase the records. Satellite imagery released years later showed an unnatural scar in the Siberian tundra, a perfect circle nearly half a kilometer wide where the facility once stood. Local hunters spoke of a forbidden hollow where no snow settled, even in midwinter. Environmental teams sent in the early 2000s recorded abnormal chemical traces in the soil, compounds unknown to any modern database. By 2018, when an unmarked box from the Leipzig archives surfaced, Winterglass was still a whisper in the intelligence community, but that discovery changed everything. The documents inside revealed a network of collaborators across the Eastern Bloc and beyond. Western scientists had been feeding data through neutral intermediaries, trading silence for samples. The Cold War, it seemed, had not been fought only across borders. It had been shared in laboratories under the quiet consent of men who valued progress more than morality. The human cost was buried under bureaucracy. Test subjects, prisoners, political dissidents, the expendable, were listed only as biological units. Their identities erased before the first experiments began. One recovered report described neurological collapse following exposure to cryogenic aerosol. Another detailed skin lesions, consistent with sub-zero necrosis. To the scientists, these were results. To history, they were ghosts. When the Winterglass files were finally examined by international historians, they painted a picture more haunting than any single experiment. It was not merely about one program, but about an era when knowledge itself became a battlefield. Both East and West had flirted with the same abyss, weaponizing nature, rewriting biology, pushing science into silence. Standing before those declassified pages, One archivist recalled the stillness of the paper itself. "It felt like holding a confession," she said, "one written not by a man, but by a century." The full truth of Operation Winterglass remains incomplete. Many files are still missing, likely destroyed before the Soviet collapse. Yet every so often, new fragments appear in obscure databases, each shedding light on the Cold War fought beneath the ice. And through them, one realization grows harder to ignore: that in the pursuit of power, the line between survival and destruction was thinner than the glass that covered that frozen land. Chapter 3: The Vanished Convoy of Operation Cinderpath. The sea north of Norway is an unforgiving place, cold, black and heavy with secrets. In 2020, when sonar scans revealed a cluster of unidentified wrecks deep below the Norwegian Sea, the world saw only a blip on a radar. But for the intelligence community, it was a ghost returning. The vessels bore British markings erased from history, part of a mission that never officially existed: Operation Cinderpath. Its name had first appeared in fragments of post-war naval correspondence, heavily redacted and dismissed as clerical error. But the recovered wrecks told another story. 5 transport ships, all modified for chemical containment, 2 escort destroyers. No survivors, no records of departure, and yet they had sailed under the Union Jack. To understand Cinderpath, we have to return to 1946. The war was over, but the cleanup had only begun. Across Europe, Allied forces were cataloguing the horrors left behind: bunkers, laboratories, and testing grounds filled with materials no one knew how to destroy. Germany's defeat had uncovered more than weapons. It had uncovered ambition, some of it so dangerous that even victory could not cleanse it. Among the classified discoveries were documents from the German Chemical Warfare Division at Die Herrenfurth, outlining experimental nerve agents never used in battle but perfected for mass production. The Allies had seized samples, formulas, and scientists. The Soviets had done the same, but not all of it could be divided. Some research was deemed too lethal, too unstable to study, or even to acknowledge. Cinderpath was conceived in this silence. Its purpose, according to the limited surviving orders, was the secure transfer and disposal of unauthorized biological material. The convoy departed from Hamburg under cover of night, bound for the British naval base at Scapa Flow. But somewhere along its route, it vanished. No distress calls, no flares. Only the endless winter sea. For decades, families of the crew were told their loved ones were lost in a training accident. The case was closed, until that sonar image appeared 70 years later. When divers reached the site, they found the first ship lying on its side, hull split open like a wound. Inside were sealed containers, warped and blackened but still intact. Each one bore the same inscription: Property of the War Office, Restricted Level Omega. Nearby, the divers' cameras captured something stranger: cables and monitoring equipment that appeared to have been added later, post-1946. Someone had been down there before. The British Ministry of Defence immediately classified the footage, but a copy leaked. Analysts noticed details that didn't match any post-war naval design. American-made sensors, 1950s technology. That meant one of two things. Either the wreck had been revisited during the Cold War, or it had never truly been abandoned. Declassified MI6 memos from the late 1950s mention an Omega Containment Recovery Initiative. The wording is vague, but the context suggests retrieval, not disposal. What was meant to be destroyed had instead been preserved. Some historians now believe the convoy carried captured German chemical or biological prototypes, materials neither side could afford to let the other study. The tragedy of Cinderpath, however, was not only its loss, but its secrecy. Dozens of sailors had died unknowingly carrying a cargo that might have been the deadliest ever loaded aboard British vessels. One recovered logbook fragment from a destroyer reads simply, "Orders changed. We are to maintain blackout. No radio contact permitted. Escort engaged in unusual formation. Unclear purpose." The final entry ends mid-sentence. In interviews with retired naval intelligence officers, one phrase repeats, "plausible disposal." In the chaos of post-war reconstruction, plausible meant deniable. It meant that if something went wrong, it could be buried, along with the men who had been ordered to carry it, and something did go wrong. Chemical analysis of samples taken from the wreck site revealed compounds not consistent with any known nerve agent of the period. The reaction patterns suggested a hybrid, part organic, part metallic. a weaponized enzyme capable of corroding synthetic fuel. In other words, a form of warfare that could cripple entire fleets without firing a single shot. If true, it explains the urgency, the secrecy, and the silence. The materials on board were never supposed to exist. Their discovery would have violated the Allied agreements on war materials and exposed both sides for exploiting Nazi science. When confronted in 2021, British defense officials refused comment. Citing national security interests, Norway declared the area off-limits. But the data remains, and so does the wreck, resting beneath the waves. A grave for men who never knew what they carried. Those who have studied Cinderpath's surviving documents describe an almost ritual effort to erase it. Destroyed manifests, false registry numbers, ship names reassigned. It was as if someone had reached into history and torn a page out of time itself. Yet history resists erasure. The sea remembers, metal remembers, and when light finally touches the depths, it tells the truth the surface will not. In the end, Operation Cinderpath was more than a mission. It was a turning point, the moment when the moral boundaries of victory blurred, when the victors became the custodians of the very darkness they claimed to defeat. The wreckage beneath the Norwegian Sea is silent now, but in that silence, one can almost hear the faint echo of engines and the weight of secrets sinking into the cold. Chapter 4: The Moscow Signal Revisited. For years, it was only a rumor whispered through the corridors of diplomacy. A strange pulse that haunted the walls of the US Embassy in Moscow. In the 1950s, staff began to complain of headaches, fatigue, and a strange sense of pressure behind their eyes. Typewriters jammed without reason, radios hissed in perfect rhythm. Even the birds seemed to avoid the building's upper floors. Officially, it was nothing. Just paranoia in a city already defined by it. But the Americans gave it a name: the Moscow Signal. The first reports reached Washington quietly. Frequency spikes, measured by embassy technicians, showed a narrow beam of microwave radiation trained directly at the building from a nearby apartment block. The readings were weak, barely perceptible. Still, it was enough to cause alarm. The Soviet Union denied everything, claiming the emissions were part of routine communications testing. But diplomats knew better. Something was being aimed at them, and no one could explain why. In 1965, a classified memorandum circulated within the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. It noted consistent health anomalies among stationed personnel, especially among those assigned to the upper floors facing the direction of the beam. The memo was marked eyes only and archived. Then, silence. Behind the scenes, the CIA launched a covert study, Operation Spectral Dust. Its objective: determine if electromagnetic exposure could alter human behavior or disrupt communications. Scientists were flown to a nondescript facility in Virginia. They tested shielding materials, measured brainwave activity, and monitored volunteers under prolonged exposure. The findings remain partially redacted, but one line from a surviving document stands out. Subject reports disorientation, loss of equilibrium, and intrusive auditory phenomena. In Moscow, embassy staff continued their work under the quiet understanding that they were being watched and perhaps targeted. The atmosphere inside the building shifted. Typists flinched at sudden tones in the air. Security officers carried handheld meters disguised as cigarette cases, scanning walls for invisible intrusions. The ambassador's office, once a symbol of American resolve, became a chamber of suspicion. When Ambassador Walter Stoessel fell ill in 1974, suffering from chronic blood disorders, whispers began to circulate. Several other staffers experienced similar symptoms. One doctor's report, later declassified, mentioned abnormal white cell counts consistent with prolonged radiation exposure. The connection was never proven. It didn't have to be. For those who lived through it, the pattern was clear. The discovery decades later, in 2019, changed everything. When a set of digitized NSA logs from the 1970s were released under the Freedom of Information Act, researchers noticed something remarkable. The readings weren't random. They followed a deliberate modulation pattern, frequency shifts that matched early radar communication techniques. The Moscow signal wasn't just interference, it was data. Some analysts believe it was part of an advanced surveillance method, using microwave reflections off embassy windows to capture conversations inside. Others think it was a behavioral experiment, testing how low-level electromagnetic exposure could influence cognition or mood. Whatever its purpose, one truth became unavoidable. Both sides were experimenting with invisible weapons long before the public had words for them. When confronted, former Soviet engineers denied involvement but hinted at counter-surveillance initiatives authorized by the KGB's Technical Directorate. One retired officer described them as scientific chess moves in an invisible war. The Americans, he said, did the same. The Cold War, after all, wasn't just fought in deserts or jungles. It was fought in frequencies, in silence, in the unseen hum of progress. The Moscow signal faded from the air by the late 1970s. The embassy was rebuilt, shielded, and reinforced. Official investigations concluded there was no conclusive evidence of harm. The world moved on, but for those who served there, the story never ended. When documentary crews interviewed surviving embassy staff decades later, the memories were sharp. "We felt it," one communications officer said. "It wasn't fear of the Soviets, it was fear of what we couldn't detect. The air itself felt alive." Another recalled the constant ringing in her ears, the dizziness that never left. You tell yourself it's nothing, but it was always there, whispering. Historians now see the Moscow signal as a pivotal moment, a quiet threshold between the old world of espionage and the modern era of invisible warfare. It revealed not only the lengths nations would go to spy on one another, but how far they would go to deny it. Today, new technologies echo that same question in a different key. Electromagnetic crowd control devices, directed energy weapons, non-lethal deterrents. The science born in secrecy has evolved in plain sight, yet the legacy of the Moscow signal lingers, reminding us that not all battles are seen, and not all weapons are designed to kill. In the end, the truth was not in the beam itself, but in what it represented, a warning from a past that disguised progress as protection. A signal sent across time, still humming quietly beneath the noise of history. Chapter 5. The Silent City of Kishtim. The forest outside Chelyabinsk is quiet now. Trees grow where fences once stood. The wind moves through rusted towers, carrying no voices, only memory. But beneath that stillness lies one of the darkest secrets of the Cold War, the silent city, known in whispers as Kishtim. For decades, the name barely existed on maps. Officially, it was Chelyabinsk 40, a closed Soviet city built to serve one purpose, the Mayak nuclear complex. It was here, in 1948, that the Soviet Union produced its first weapons-grade plutonium, racing to match the West's atomic arsenal. Thousands of workers lived behind barbed wire and secrecy. They were told their work was heroic, vital to the survival of the motherland. Few knew what it was doing to them. The disaster began quietly. September 1957, a cooling system failed in one of the storage tanks deep inside Mayak. What followed was a chain reaction that Soviet officials would classify as industrial incident, number 817. In truth, it was the third largest nuclear disaster in history. An explosion so powerful it blew the 80-ton lid off the containment structure, releasing radioactive dust across hundreds of square kilometers. Villages disappeared overnight. Soldiers in unmarked uniforms evacuated entire districts under the cover of darkness. Families were told they were being relocated for development. None were told the real reason. Those who refused didn't survive long enough to tell their story. For 30 years, the Soviet Union denied it ever happened. The word radiation was forbidden. Locals who fell ill were diagnosed with nervous exhaustion. Children were born sick, and the earth itself turned poisonous. Kishtim became a city of silence, erased from maps but alive in rumors, a ghost industrial complex at the edge of the known world. When the Iron Curtain fell, pieces of the truth began to leak out. Former workers described secret burial grounds where contaminated equipment was dumped under concrete slabs. Others spoke of entire neighborhoods sealed off, their buildings stripped for salvage, their names erased. Western intelligence analysts dismissed most of it as Cold War propaganda until the photos surfaced. In 2023, a group of Russian urban explorers posted grainy footage from deep inside the restricted zone. Their flashlights revealed rows of corroded reactors, walls scorched and cracked, radiation meters screaming in the background. They found a chamber sealed by a reinforced steel door bearing the emblem of Minsk, the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. the organization responsible for the Soviet atomic program. Etched into the concrete were serial numbers, dates, and something more, a US patent stamp. The explorers didn't understand what they'd found, but nuclear historians did. The designs matched American reactor patents filed in the early 1950s, technology that should never have crossed the Iron Curtain. Within days, the footage vanished from the internet. The explorers' social media accounts were deleted. One was reportedly detained. The others, no one could confirm. What the footage suggested was impossible, that Soviet and Western entities had, at some level, cooperated or traded technology in the earliest, most secret stages of the nuclear arms race. It was collaboration hidden behind confrontation, a shadow economy of science and survival, operating in the grey space between ideology and annihilation. When investigators returned to Kishtim under official sanction, the site was unrecognizable. Radiation still clung to the soil. Instruments failed within hours. The ruins were collapsing into themselves, as if the earth wanted to bury the evidence. Still, deep beneath the rubble, they found microfilm canisters, fragments of reactor logs, procurement orders, and correspondence between unnamed foreign consultants. Every letter was coded, every signature blacked out. The documents painted a chilling picture. After the 1957 explosion, cleanup crews were not trained scientists but conscripted laborers. They worked without protection, scraping contaminated soil with bare hands. Many never left the site. Their bodies, according to one declassified memo, were buried in controlled proximity to material waste, a phrase that stripped humanity from tragedy. One survivor, interviewed decades later, recalled the moment he realized the truth. "They told us it was a power station accident," he said. "But when I saw soldiers with lead aprons carrying dead cattle into pits, I knew the land itself had died." His voice trembled as he added, "And yet we kept working. We were told the West could never know." The Kishtim disaster remained buried because it had to. Admitting it would have revealed not only the scale of the Soviet nuclear buildup, but the fragile moral line that all superpowers walked during the Cold War, the willingness to poison their own people to preserve the illusion of control. When international archives finally released partial records in 2024, they confirmed what many had suspected. Western companies had supplied components under the guise of medical isotope research. Some of those same firms later participated in US nuclear testing programs. The divide between enemy and ally, it turned out, had been thinner than anyone dared imagine. Today, the forests around Kishtim have begun to reclaim the land. Wild grass covers what was once reactor concrete. The Geiger counters still click, faint but steady, a heartbeat of history that refuses to stop. Locals avoid the area, calling it Mrtvý les, the dead forest. Yet within that silence lies a truth the world has barely begun to face. Kishtim is not just a story of disaster, it is a reflection of humanity's deepest paradox. The drive to build what should never exist, and the instinct to bury it once it does. Its ruins stand as monuments not of progress but of denial, and as long as the ground hums with the residue of what was done there, the past remains alive, whispering its warning to those who listen. In the stillness of that forbidden city, where the wind speaks for the dead and the trees grow through concrete, one lesson endures. Power once unchained does not disappear. It waits, silent, patient, and eternal.